Today we have a very special guest joining us, David Garofalo. David serves as the CEO and chairman of the board at Gold Royalty. David has worked in various leadership capacities in the natural resources sector for over the last 30 years, including as president and CEO of Gold Corp until its sale to Newmont in 2019. Prior to joining Gold Corp, David led Hudbay Minerals, where he presided over that company's emergence as a leading metals producer, as well as various senior executive positions with other mining companies, including Agnico Eagle. Thanks again for joining us on The Rocks. Let's dive in. Well, Dave, thanks so much for coming on The Rocks today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks very much for having me, Emily.
Yeah, excited to have you here. And the most important question of the podcast, what are you drinking today?
Well, I am drinking a local brew, Russell beer, which is actually local to Vancouver. And my brother-in-law is the head of marketing, so I get the beer for free, I have to admit. He brings a 6-pack or 12-pack every weekend because we have Sunday dinners with the extended family, and he always brings me beer. And I like it. I'm not a big connoisseur of alcohol generally, but the Russell beer is great with pizza.
Very cool. Very cool. What led him to get into the beer business? Is there a story behind it?
He's a bar star. He grew up in the bars and did bartending and all that sort of stuff, but he has a creative streak in him and went to art school and whatnot. And so he does all these labels on all the different beers that they have. He designed. And now he's the director of marketing, kind of grew up through the business. But I guess he sacrificed his liver to the cause, I guess, over the years. And now he's getting recompense.
Very cool. Well, we are filming the week of Memorial Day here in the US. So I'm drinking one of my favorite bourbons, which is Horse Soldier Bourbon. And this is a bourbon. The distillery was started by some of the horse soldiers that rode in to Afghanistan, the American Special Forces guys that rode into Afghanistan right after 9/11. My husband and I know a few of the guys, and they also make a great bourbon. So phenomenal story, but also great bourbon. So in honor of Memorial Day, I'm drinking that.
Well, that's a really cool story. And so I have to give a shout out to my son, who's 26, and he's a second lieutenant in the Royal Canadian Air Force. So this day is important to him too.
Absolutely. Thank him for his service, and you all as well, because the family is served just as much as the guys and girls that are in the military. Cheers to him.
Thank you. Cheers.
You know, innovation seems to be such a theme in your career. And even now with running a royalty company, which maybe people would think is an unexpected choice, given what you've done in past roles. And I think royalty companies are really innovative in how they approach mining finance and how they're able to talk to generalist investors and give them exposure to the market in a totally different way. Do you see it the same way? Is there innovation in royalty companies?
There is. I mean, they're an innovative source of capital. I think they're relatively new to the space. My chair of my advisory board is Ian Telfer. He created the whole streaming royalty model back about 15 years ago with the creation of Wheaton Precious Metals. And so that opened up a whole avenue of capital, a non-traditional source of capital for mining exploration and development. And thank goodness he did that, because for a long period of time, the capital markets, at least traditional capital markets, were shut down for the junior explorers and developers, the emerging producers. They couldn't otherwise raise capital. And the royalty streaming companies have been a consistent source of capital for that type of development. So yeah, no, they are innovative. You know, I run a company called Gold Royalty. You know, we're not financial engineers. We've all come from an operating background. I've spent 30 years on the operating side of the business. Ian Telfer obviously founded Gold Corp and Wheaton Precious Metals and Wheaton River before that. And he was at TVX. Alan Hare, who's on my board, was my successor as CEO at Hudbay, and he was Chief Operating Officer, 35 years as a mine builder and operator. Alistair Still, who's running our parent company and doing technical services for the royalty vehicle. Again, a prolific mine builder, operator. You know, we come at it from an operational perspective. So we are not just financial engineers. We've done a lot of innovative work on the operation and development side.
I don't think I've ever heard that, financial engineers.
Well, there's been a proliferation of these royalty vehicles that have come into the space recently. They're not being run by operators or former operators. They're being run by investment bankers, accountants, people that haven't really built anything other than a spreadsheet. And so it's a bit of a different perspective. It's not to say they can't be successful, and a number of them are, but we do have a clear-eyed view of the underlying risk of the assets we're investing in because we've actually operated and developed mines. I think that's a tremendous competitive advantage when we're looking at royalty opportunities.
Yeah, and maybe for those people listening who maybe aren't familiar with the industry, what does it mean to be a mine builder?
I have developed a number of mines in my career. I was with Inmet to start my career in the base metal side, then spent 12 years at Agnico, 6 years running Hudbay, and then 3.5 years running Goldcorp. And over my career, I've been involved in the development of about 15 different mines, new mines, all of which I think are still operating to this day. These are generational assets that are still very much contributing to the mining sector. So that means doing the feasibility work, raising the financing, physical active construction, commissioning, operational readiness, leading into commissioning, and then getting to steady state operations and actually generating a rate of return on all that invested capital. That's what mine development is. It's that whole life cycle of a mine.
I think it's an important distinction because people who are maybe looking at the industry for the first time may not differentiate between an exploration company that's going out finding projects versus a development company or a producer, right? And they have very different profiles, level of risk, and things that you have to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And I'd be the first to tell you, as a mine operator, that we don't do grassroots exploration well. We rely on the juniors who, by and large, are far more successful at it and have the skill set and the risk tolerance to do it. And if they weren't around, we wouldn't survive as a mining industry. We need the generative work being done at the ground level with that kind of risk embracing mentality. When you're running an operating company, it's all about avoiding risk. It's about making sure your workforce is safe, that you're environmentally responsible, that you're not realizing significant capital costs or operating cost inflation. It's all about mitigating that risk. When you're a junior, honestly, you're swinging for the fences every time you put a drill hole down. And that requires a different mindset, much more entrepreneurial and risk embracing than the operators can do. And as a result, throughout my career, recognizing that, whether it was with Agnico, Hudbay, or Goldcorp, we always had incubator funds set up for the juniors. At Goldcorp, we had about $200 million invested in various juniors. I think we had about 20 or 30 in the portfolio. And that was during a time when the juniors couldn't raise money to save their lives. There was no access to capital markets. But we recognized at Goldcorp and Agnico before that, Hudbay, that we needed them to be successful to populate our pipelines, with development stage opportunities. And so if we weren't providing them capital, we'd be cutting ourselves off at the knees.
I think that's such a unique thing to the mining industry because we've talked on an earlier podcast with Tara Christie of Banyan Gold. She was explaining to the listeners why it's important for smaller or younger exploration companies to have larger companies invested in them at an early stage, right? And how does that work? But it's a critical part of that pipeline, like you said, for companies to have insight into what's going on with the juniors.
Mining's an ecosystem. We all kind of rely on each other. Everybody has a role, whether it's the royalty companies, the juniors, the emerging producers. We all have a responsibility to each other. And so we have to make sure we support each other when, maybe traditional capital markets aren't open to them.
Yeah. And why do you think it is that royalty companies have been able to fill that niche where other traditional sources of capital haven't gone in? What makes it so different about a royalty company?
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that you're really only taking top line risk when you're running a royalty company, or if you're investing in a royalty company, you're getting a fixed percentage of the revenue. You're not exposed to the underlying operating costs and capital cost risk inflation, or capital cost inflation risk, I should say. And so that means that generally they're perceived as a lower risk leverage opportunity to the gold price and exploration success. So as a result, they tend to get a better multiple in the space. What that means is that their cost of capital is lower. So they provide a conduit to the developers and explorers to lower cost capital. There's a tremendous arbitrage opportunity in that. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I was running Hudbay, we built the Constancia copper project in Peru. Hudbay was the biggest project we'd ever done in 100 years of our history. And it was a $2 billion investment. And we needed capital from non-traditional sources. We were only about $1.5 billion market cap. And we had about 5% of our revenue that was precious metals. And we said, well, maybe we should stream that off. Called Randy Smallwood at Wheaton Precious. He cut me a check for $750 million. And we put that capital to work. The reason that made sense economically is Randy was trading at 2 times net asset value. We were trading at 0.5 times net asset value. And so equity was prohibitively expensive, but he paid us 1 times net asset value for that stream. We both won. He got that stream re-rated at 2 times. We got a bump from 0.5 to 1 times on that component of our revenue. And we built an asset that's going to last for generations and still the cornerstone of my base business.
I think that's part of what makes it so cool. I love to see projects that actually get built, right? And companies that go into production. And oftentimes, I think in our industry, probably because we have so many, calling myself out here a little bit, we have geologists that run companies and you get in love with the asset. And sometimes it's, you just want to keep drilling, keep doing more exploration as opposed to, hey, like, let's start producing gold out of this thing, right?
Well, I love the geos. You need that passion on your side. They fall in love with the deposits. They have a geological thesis, and they're willing to bet their life savings on it. It's people mortgage their houses to do it, and because they're true believers. You need that type of mentality in the space. We need people with that kind of passion for the geology. Otherwise, we wouldn't be finding the major discoveries, and we need to replace our depleting reserve bases.
Absolutely. But sometimes you got to say, we've got enough to move forward, right? But no, I just think I think there are different aspects of the industry that bringing in different financing structures or options allow you to be more innovative with how you bring a project into development or manage it. Is there anything, when you look at the industry as a whole, is there like a technical innovation or an operational innovation that you think the industry as a whole is kind of missing a window that would change the way we do business?
Yeah, look, I think the biggest impediment to new mine development tends to be the whole social element, not having a holistic approach to stakeholder engagement. And that starts with the local communities, right? When you're doing that first drill hole and exploring for the first time, making the right first impression and letting them know you're responsible and you're looking to share the economic benefits from anything you find. And there's a clear path to doing that. But I'd say by and large, the biggest impediment to new mine development is the perceived or real lack of water, more than carbon intensity. And I know carbon intensity is definitely topical right now, and it's important that we reduce our carbon intensity. But I think we're seeing our energy intensity go down. And in fact, when I was running Goldcorp, we built the first all-electric underground mine in the world, important mine in Ontario, near the Timmins district. That equipment is getting scaled quickly. And I think we're going to see a lot more electrified mines in the future. And so I think our carbon intensity is going in the right direction. But our water intensity is still extremely high. Wars are fought over water. So you can imagine passions that inflames in local communities if you're perceived to be consuming water, fresh water, and diverting it from sources they're using for agricultural activity, industrial activity, whatever pre-exists in the area that you're trying to develop the mine. So if we can be seen as effective stewards of water going into new areas where we want to develop mines, we're going to have a much easier path to getting that social license to operate. When I look at our mining industry, we still continue to build traditional tailings facilities. And those tailings facilities are big water hogs. So they consume a lot of water, and our recycling, while improving, is still not at a level that I feel comfortable that we're going to get that social license to operate. Plus, traditional tailings facilities, notwithstanding the water consumption, stigmatize the industry because when something goes wrong there, it's kind of like running the airline industry. When you have a plane crash, it's always catastrophic. When you have a tailings breach, it's rare, just like plane crashes, but when it happens, it's always catastrophic and gives the industry a black eye. So we have to get out of the business of traditional tailings impoundments. And the best way to do that is to start to look at dehydrated tailings technologies. And they exist commercially. We had 2 dry stack tailings facilities in 2 of our operations when I was running Goldcorp. We had one when I was at Agnico as well. And that technology is being scaled very, very quickly. FL Schmidt has these huge filter presses now. They can support mining facilities of up to 60, 70,000 tons of ore per day. And so that gives you a sense of the scale. Now, we need bigger scale filters than that, but I have a lot of confidence that technology is going to be scaled. And we need to get out of traditional tailings impoundments, traditional tailings construction. They're capital intensive, water intensive, and super risky from a social perspective. So if we can drive down our water consumption, recycle more of it, and also as a happy byproduct of that, make our tailings inert so you don't have that risk of a big tailings breach, then it'll pave the way to much more mining development and getting that social license to operate.
And could you explain a little bit about how that works, a dry tailings operation? Like, what does that look like with a filter?
Well, those filter presses are used to the same filter presses that are used to produce concentrates, zinc, copper concentrates. You're effectively dehydrating the concentrates in order to put them into shippable form, and rail cars and trucks and the like. It's the same technology, but it's being scaled to a much higher quantity in order to deal with tailings. Because reality is 99.9% of what we pull out of mines, both open pit and underground, is not metal. It goes into the tailings facilities. So we have to dehydrate those tailings, and effectively creates bales of tailings that get stacked. That's why it's called dry stack tailings. As a result, you don't need to build big tailings facilities, so you're reducing capital intensity up front, and you're creating an inert material that just doesn't move. It just gets stacked, and you don't have to worry about flooding local communities or flooding waterways and whatnot. It's a very, very good technology in order to deal with all the inherent risks of water consumption and potential daily tailing facility breaches.
I mean, that just makes complete sense.
Technology is catching up, and it does require. It's not a technology that's necessarily commercially available at a sufficient scale for a lot of open pit operations, large open pit operations. But the industry really needs to focus dollars on scaling that technology quickly, because these tailings facility issues are not going to go away, and they're going to be, as I said, a big impediment to this developing new mines. And we need to develop new mines. If we want to decarbonize the economy, guess what? We need a lot of copper. And copper production is not going up in the face of starkly higher demand. Demand is going to be intensifying dramatically as we electrify car vehicles increasingly across the world. As we continue to urbanize economies, we need a lot more copper. We don't have, as an industry, the capacity to meet the demand for the foreseeable future. So we have to really scale up our exploration and our development activities. And on the gold side, while it's not necessarily, it has the industrial utility that copper does, gold demand is continuing to go up and supply is coming off. We have a remarkable inelasticity to supply to price. And so we have to find ways to bring new development online more quickly. And the only way to do that is to get that social license to operate more quickly, in my view.
And who in the industry is there an organizing body or leadership cohort that could push something like that or invest in scaling that technology?
There's a number of them. At the national level, in Canada, we have PDAC and the Mining Association of Canada as well. And I'm sure there's an equivalent down in the US, and I know there is. And internationally, there's an International Council of Metals and Mining, which is actually a group of all of the large cap CEOs that meet on a regular basis. I was on the ICMM when I was running Goldcorp. That group can be a lot more effective than they currently are. Yeah, well, yeah, and I think they could be on the front foot a lot more. There were a couple of significant tailings disasters in Brazil when I was on the ICMM, and it's an uncomfortable position to be sitting in the boardroom with the CEOs running that organization and come out forcefully with a statement. So it tends to get watered down and take a long time to come out with something forceful in terms of directions we're taking on things like tailings management. And so the industry tends to be, in that organization, tends to be lowest common denominator, unfortunately. I'd like to see them take more of a leadership position on things like tailings management and the like, and social license to operate. So I would definitely hope that organizations like that take a more forceful and proactive approach on things like this.
No, I think you're spot on, because water is, especially having worked in emerging and frontier markets and really post-conflict and ongoing conflict zones. I mean, it's amazing how important water is everywhere in the world. I mean, just on the front page of one of the newspapers here in the U.S. today was about the drought that's coming on in California, right? And the questions about water for agriculture versus an industry versus people being able to water their lawns, right? And who makes those decisions. But I saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, everywhere you went, water was critical. And one of the big concerns about developing some of the assets in Afghanistan was, where would you get the water? How would you manage it? Because the people there are still extremely reliant on agriculture at the local and the international level. So it makes a whole lot of sense. It seems like something that everybody should agree to, at least in theory, and put some money behind, investing and how to scale that and operationalize it a lot faster for all the reasons you listed.
Yeah, and look, and I'm an optimist. I think it's going to become an imperative for us to do that as an industry. And I think the dollars, even if they are coming a bit late, we'll start to get devoted to that because we're going to need to develop new mines. And I think dealing with water intensity and dealing with it quickly will get us in a much better position to be able to develop new mines.
So, in your role running a royalty company, do you look at these kinds of factors when you evaluate companies?
We're not operators. We're partnering with operators, so we can't have a direct influence over the day-to-day business. But what we can do is establish stringent criteria for the types of companies we want to invest in. So yeah, it starts with the geological model. We have to have confidence that the resources are there and that there's exploration upside to deliver that kind of optionality that our shareholders are looking for from a geological standpoint. But we want to make sure that we're with responsible operators. And the best operators tend to be the most responsible anyway. So you want to partner with operators that deliver results, but they tend to do that focusing on all of the best ESG practices. And it starts with employee safety, but also environmental practices, carbon intensity, water consumption. We do look at that. That is a factor. And I remember shortly after IPO, we were looking at a project that looked good geologically, but the operator was from the developing world and had a horrible environmental track record. Would have loved to be a partner on the asset, but could not partner with that operator just given their track record. We weren't confident that we wouldn't be exposed to some very embarrassing development at the site, in terms of their safety and environmental practices. We just had to give it a pass.
And that's really, I think, the way that bigger changes will happen, right? If the money flows to the companies that are doing things the right way, everyone else will be incentivized to pay attention to what investors or financiers are looking for.
Exactly.
Well, you mentioned ESG, and one question that we consistently look at is like, how do you evaluate ESG? Because environmental can, in some ways, can be quantified, right? But the social and governance side can be much harder to put a metric to, right? Since in running Prospector, of course, everybody wants like a number that can be put on a dashboard. And this company gets a 7 out of 10, and here's why. But it's really a lot more complicated than that with mining, wouldn't you say?
It is and it isn't. I think there are ways to quantify. I mean, when we were in Goldcorp, we actually scored ourselves on a broad spectrum ESG practices from safety to environmental to water consumption and whatnot. And yeah, it's not easy, but it's, I think, very important to try to quantify your progress in that. So if you measure it, you're going to manage it. So finding a way to measure it, I think, is extremely important. I think things that may seem unquantifiable or actually are when you put your mind to it. And we were able to demonstrate that. We had a very holistic system to manage all of our ESG practices within Goldcorp. And I would say that was the same case at Hudbay and before that. That's why these operators are still around doing what they do, is because they've been very responsible stewards on all of the ESG practices and measure it quite effectively.
So maybe it's less about a metric where you can compare one company to another and more about how is that company measuring it internally and showing a dedication to progress.
Yeah. I mean, that means establishing a baseline of where your business is today when you've kind of launched this kind of holistic measuring process. Get that baseline established and then measure your progress against that baseline. To a degree, if you can, measuring yourself against your competitors, I think, is important. There are broad-based metrics available on things like safety, for example. It's very easy for you to measure your safety progress in terms of your lost time injury frequency against your competitors because it's a very, very commonly used metric. And I think increasingly you're going to find more commonly used metrics on things that seem fuzzy in the past. I think we're becoming better at measuring our progress in a whole host of ESG practices and principles.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think just the fact that people ask about ESG when it comes to mining companies is a step forward, as opposed to maybe a few years ago it was all on CSR, right? Corporate social responsibility, which to me was always a little bit more of like a PR angle. I mean, certainly doing good work, but it was more about what can we tell people about what we're doing in the local community, as opposed to also some other issues that are really important.
Yeah, you're right. We've become much more holistic in terms of managing those issues. It's not just about tons and grade anymore. It's about all of the ancillary things that and spin outs of your business that have to be managed, and you can't ignore them. Multi-stakeholder engagement, social mapping around your mine sites. The level of sophistication around ESG has been brought to a level I've never seen in 30 years. I think the industry by and large is doing a very, very good job.
Yeah. And I kind of tease off of a theme that I talked about with my friend Beatrice, who runs diversity and inclusion at Newmont, that part of how we'll encourage people to pay attention to the industry is if we're also able to recruit people who are excited about ESG into the industry, which is where I think work-life balance becomes a whole theme. And I'm going to ask you a question that I get asked all the time, but I don't think the guys in the industry get asked often enough. You run multiple companies. You sit on multiple boards. You've got a family. I'm sure you've got nonprofit boards and things that you're involved in as well. How do you manage work-life balance in the mining industry?
By getting involved with things I'm passionate about. And I think that's fair to ask the guys about work-life balance because I'm a father. I have, between myself and my wife, we have 8 kids, and they demand our time. So
Yeah.
it's not like I have a choice, but I'm passionate, just as equally passionate about being a father as I am about being a professional in the mining industry. And so I'm doing the things that I love. And I would say the same thing on the nonprofit side. I want to be a responsible member of my community here in Vancouver. And so I do nonprofit boards. We have a family foundation and we support a lot of local charities. And we have direct involvement in. It's not just about cutting a check. We want to understand what they're spending their money on. Just trying to be responsible about everything you're doing. And if you can't do it, if you don't think you can balance it, don't do it. If you're going to do it poorly, it's not worth doing. I placed a premium on being a father as much as being a mining professional. And somebody asked me not that long ago in an interview, if you hadn't been a C-suite executive in the mining business, what would you have done? And my answer was actually, I would have been a stay-at-home dad. I would do that in a heartbeat. Like fatherhood to me, can't say I did it absolutely perfectly, when you're trying to run companies and whatnot, but it's the one that gave me the most workplace satisfaction, if you workplace is, raising good kids. And say Christy and I have 8 really good kids, and they're not graduated from university, they're in university or headed to university. So I think we've done pretty well because we've been passionate about it. So I don't see it as picking one over the other. It's just doing what you like doing. And if you like doing it, you're probably going to be good at it.
No, I totally agree. And I get asked a lot. And my answer is that I actually don't try to balance. I try to integrate as much as I can, because I have a hard time with balancing. I picture it as like a seesaw, your family on one side and work on the other. And it just isn't a very good mental picture to me, as opposed to, for me, why I became a mining entrepreneur was so I could continue to work with my husband and we could bring, our daughter with us to mine sites. She's been to a drill program. She's been in, mine tunnels and stuff, and she's 5 years old. She licked a rock at 6 months. So we figured she's definitely going to be a geo as opposed to an engineer if we have our way. I think the industry is unique in that so much of our work can be in remote locations, where a lot of people who work in the industry have to travel away from their families in order to work. And I've heard from a few folks that, number one, COVID has been a benefit in that way, that companies have figured out things that can be done from home or not on site, but also the, fly in, fly out model may need to be adjusted a little bit. I've been lucky in that I just bring them along.
Well, I brought a number of my kids to mine sites in the past to show them what dad does. They've always enjoyed it and been super engaged. And so I totally empathize.
Yeah. And I think that's part of why, as an industry, I don't understand why there are so many cartoons about dogs and cats and whatever that do construction jobs. And yet we don't have any mining cartoons. This was something else. I'm like, what kid doesn't love to go to a mine where you have massive dump trucks and big piles of dirt, right? It should be the perfect setting for a cartoon or a kid's show. I'm sure the health and safety folks would freak out at that. But you got to get more kids out to mines at an earlier age, I think, to get them excited about the industry.
There was a show that when my son was young, it was called Mighty Machines. And it was in syndication. Maybe you've seen it, but they would go to wherever big machines were. Construction. They actually did visit Agnico's LaRonde mine in one of the episodes.
Oh, that's
I was
cool.
working
Very
at Agnico. Yeah, yeah.
I'll have to look that up. Yeah. I mean, Madeline's big memory when she came down to Analog's, mine at the time was just an adit, a sampling adit, but we went in and her big memory, she would have been 4 at the time, is like, what did you see when you went with mommy and daddy, down to Mexico to the gold mine? She's like, there were bats in there, right? That was the formative. I'm like, okay, yeah, I can see why that would be fun for a 4-year-old. Well, do you have any advice then on work-life balance or managing boards and executive roles for folks that are thinking about that?
Do what you like. That's what I would say. And if you don't like it, don't do it. I've always been very fortunate just doing what I enjoy, doing it with people that I like. And that's been the case throughout my entire career. I've had nothing but positive experiences just because I've associated myself with really good people and doing things that are fun. Like mine is fun. The whole development cycle from exploration, even through closure. When I was running Hud Bay's been around for 100 years. They've built over 30 mines in northern Manitoba. Guess what? 29 of them are closed. And how they managed those closures is remarkable to me. Very responsibly. They did it long before the whole ESG thing was a thing. They just did it. And that's why they've been able to sustain themselves in that district for 100 years because the governments trust them and the communities trust them. That's the great thing about mining.
Oh, very cool. And what's your favorite or most adventurous place that you've been in your career?
To me, the most memorable mine site visit I ever had, and one that's most humbling, was literally the week I started as CEO at Hud Bay back in 2010. And it was my first CEO gig. So I was feeling pretty chuffed. I'd been CEO at Agnico for 12 years and had a great run there and got my first job as CEO. And I think I decided, well, I'm going to spend my first week at the site. So I'll go up to Flin. But I was still feeling a bit, maybe my head got a bit bigger. But whatever, I walked into the site and went to Trout Lake, which is now closed, and went with Brian Day, the mine manager. It was my first day on the job. Walked into the dry about an hour after everybody had gone underground. And there was this older woman there who's cleaning the dry. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet. And I walked in, and Brian Day, my manager, introduced me to Esther. And she literally put her hands on her hip, looked me up and down. And she said, you're the new guy, aren't you? I said, yeah, I'm the new CEO of Hud Bay. And she says, you're a lot shorter than I thought you'd be. Any air that I had in my head deflated immediately there. And honestly, I was so flustered that the only thing I could think of to say is, Esther, I'm a lot shorter than I thought it would be, which makes no sense. That's the only thing I could think of to say. But
the only comeback.
She totally brought me down to size. And I love telling that story because, you're never as good as you think you are. So.
She got rid of all your cool guy points, right?
So that was the most adventurous trip, though, mine sake, but it certainly taught me a lot about
kudos to Esther. Yeah, she had that one ready, I think. Oh, no, I did not realize that you had done work in Tunisia.
Yeah, so it was a zinc mine called Bugreen. It was in Inmet back in the 90s, and it was when zinc was like 27 cents. That thing never made money. We built it for $80 million. I was involved on the development team there. I spent a lot of time in Tunisia at the time. We ended up limped out into production with zinc prices very depressed, and we ended up selling it to Breakwater for $18 million. And Breakwater ran its success for a number of years. Zinc prices started to float up, and I'm sure they more than made their investment back. But for us, it was an unwelcome distraction. We had just bought the Antamina project in Peru. So we needed to focus our capital and resources on that. So we got rid of non-core assets as a result.
I love Tunisia. I've spent a lot of time there, and it's like this little, not resort country, because that kind of minimizes it, but it's such a beautiful place to visit. And I keep saying the next time I go back, I want to go to the Star Wars sets down in the desert. That's where they filmed like the original Star Wars movies.
The other thing about Tunisia that's really interesting is it's got some of the best unspoiled, well, I wouldn't say unspoiled, but the best Roman ruins in the world. People don't realize it. It was a Roman colony, and there are some incredible Roman ruins there.
Yeah, they're absolutely gorgeous there. And also, I spent some time in Tripoli and in Libya. And like you literally go out to eat at a restaurant and you're sitting in like a Roman ruin, which anywhere else in the world would be roped off, gated off, but there's amazing history in that part of the world. They also have my favorite restaurant in Tunisia. They'll go and pull live sea urchins out of the ocean for you and like bring them to your table. The most amazing little things you can do there. Hopefully now that COVID's wrapping up, we'll get back. They were looking to do a geopark to protect a lot of the dinosaur fossils down there in the mountains, down by some of the phosphate assets. Shout out to any of my listeners in Tunisia. Well, thank you so much. We've covered a lot, from mining innovation and finance to dry tailings to adventure stories and work-life balance. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again. Look forward to having you back on soon.
Thanks a lot, Emily.
Thank you to our guest and my colleague, David Garofalo, for joining us for this episode of On the Rocks. To learn more about David and Gold Royalty, visit goldroyalty.com and check them out on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. For more about Prospector, go to prospectorportal.com or check us out on Instagram at ProspectorAI and LinkedIn at ProspectorPortal. Thanks for joining us on The Rocks. Until next time, keep your glasses full and your ice cold. Cheers.